gauge, right? You told me it's gauge. Yeah.
Gauge.
Usually, what I heard is like people usually do 13, and I know people do like 21 or something like that. So what's that?
Yeah.
Like what's
So
the difference?
That's a good question. Yeah. Basically, what you're trying to do is using a piece of flat metal or these metal gauges. You put a piece of glass on top of your mouthpiece, and you're basically measuring the lateral evenness of the curve, which is the part that breaks away from the mouthpiece. You're measuring the lateral evenness between each of the side rails, which are the contact points for the reed. And in my experience, there's all these different speculations about which gauges to use and how many to use. I feel like a lot of times what happens is, the earliest systems were only based on 5 gauges. And if you think about something that's plotting 5 gauges, the largest of which is about 50 thousandths of an inch. If you're playing a modern mouthpiece that can get as open as 130 thousandths of an inch, you're missing all those measured points beyond that. And so what you'll find in a modern measuring system is that people tend to measure further to the tip to make sure that the curve stays even as it goes down, as opposed to you have this even curve at 5 points, and then all of a sudden it starts teetering. Yeah. And basically what you get from that is an inefficient mouthpiece. It's vibrating more on one side versus the other, and it can cause a lot of problems. But for me, I started out with automotive gauges. I didn't have any of the refacing gear. It was actually, there was a lot of information on the internet, and I found a lot of that stuff to be a little bit ambiguous. So I kind of had to figure stuff out for myself. And I tend to use somewhere between 10 and I can get up to 20 measuring points. I'm just going to look at some recordings. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So I'm looking at a alto mouthpiece chart, and it's all just chicken scratch. It's not going to make a lot of sense to anybody, but these are all measurements I took, and depending on the size of the mouthpiece, I might take more. So if it's a Barry Sachs mouthpiece, I'll take more measurements. Or if it's a tenor mouthpiece that's quite open, I'll take many measurements. Yeah. And really, I take measurements at every 5 thousandths of an inch, which is a nice way to, in your mind's eye, without having to plug everything into a computer, you can see the type of curve that you're putting on as it graduates more efficiently and more evenly. Whereas I think some gauge systems, they measure really a lot of points early in the break and then less points as you get further down the break. And that works too, especially if you're plugging it into an Excel spreadsheet, which can basically show you a physical curve and give you kind of an expanded view of what you would see if you were to plot out a curve on a chart. And I do that to some extent, but mostly I've done so many now, I kind of know where target points are. Just in my head, I have them memorized, so I know where I can go. But I also feel like there's a lot of this unspoken ability to just feel your way through the end of the curve as you're applying a curve. And the way you put a curve on a mouthpiece is you're taking a mouthpiece and you're dragging it across sandpaper. It's not a very cute thing when it starts. It's very abrasive and there's dust flying everywhere. But really, at some point, especially if you get into a system that you can really feel is comfortable for you, you start to feel that you're putting on an even curve. And there's many ways that I measure, to check and see that my curve stays even and that it goes all the way to the end of the mouthpiece. In other words, from the beginning to the end. But there are many different ways to do it, like I said, and a lot of guys that I admire that do this work as well, they have their own systems, and some of them are pretty open with that information and others are not. They hold their cards close to them. But for me, I have no problem sharing how I do it and what works for me.
What kind of response you tend to, go that direction?
Interesting. Yeah. Thanks for asking that. That's important because I still get a chance every once in a while to, if I get a cool mouthpiece, I'll put on a curve that I want to play. And so for me, I feel like the most efficient for me, because I tend to blow fairly hard, is something that has a slight bit of resistance. In other words, I have to work a tiny bit, not a lot, but a little bit. And it's because I feel it's easier to direct the airstream over the baffle the correct way, but also to shape your sound, something to push against. A lot of guys like super free blowing facings and try to adjust the amount of resistance with harder versus softer reeds. But I find that, to me, the life of the reed that you're using, it's shortened. If you're depending on a hard, I mean, as you know, you put a hard reed on, it's going to get soft. So for me, I tend to find facings that create a good amount of resistance with a moderately hard reed, or moderately hard, so somewhere in the middle of hard and soft, and a moderately open facing. So I like a little bit of resistance. To me, I feel like I tend to be able to push a sound more into a bright zone. So I tend to want something that would play darker. You know, if someone says dark versus bright, it typically means that they're talking about the higher partials in the sound.
Yeah, right.
You know, as opposed to, you know, so you're hearing more of those higher sounds in your sound, and it's kind of easier for me to get that stuff out, even with you know, nothing in the design of the mouthpiece to help me get there.
If I talk about Jody Jazz, I think my impression is like really, really low resistance. And so for you, like, for example, if there's a number, like 1 to 10, like how do you grade it, or, you know, like kind of thing?
Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, I think Jody Jazz mouthpiece, especially some of their DV models, I think that's what they're called. They're very low resistance, I agree. And yes, I would say they're probably, you know, one being the least resistant, they're probably like 1 or 2. I find them very very free blowing, and a lot of people are looking for that. That's part of the design, you know. I think they definitely have put that into their model. I mean, it's a reason why some guys can play, you know, they can play these 10-star tip openings and stuff like that. It's like they're very free blowing curves, and that's definitely something that you're probably going to want to consider if you're looking for something that's easier to play. When I say easier to play, I mean it requires less back pressure, you know, is kind of the best way. And then, like, compare that to, say, like a modern link. A lot of times modern links don't have really great finishing work on them. So let's go back. Let's say Van Doren. That's like the benchmark for good, you know, even curves. So, and then I find a Van Doren is somewhere kind of a little more on the resistant side. And then you get like a standard auto link, and those to me can tend to play very resistant. But like I said, they're pretty inconsistent as far as my experience is. And the last time I bought something from the factory was a year ago. So maybe something changed in a year, but those mouthpieces tend to operate a lot better with a little bit more hand finishing.
Yeah. So like for your piece, you prefer like for example, you say it's 1 or 2, right? So like, what's the number you prefer? Like it's not your customer.
Good.
It's you.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I would say like a 4, maybe a 4, even a 5. Yeah, I don't. Okay. Yeah, I find that, you know, when I get too much into that heavy resistance, it's been a long time since I've had a long gig, but I have some mouthpieces that I love the sound of that I used to play a lot. And then when I do these long gigs that were very demanding, you know, I fatigue, or if I'm practicing for a long time on these mouthpieces, I feel like, you know, after a couple of hours, I'm just like, oh, my mouth is hurting, my lungs are hurting, my throat is hurting, you know, all these different factors. So I started working my way back down. I used to play a very resistant setup with a pretty hard reed, and just learning more about this, I figured out how to get less resistance. Yeah.